Sometimes you finish a book and just don't know exactly how you feel about it, and the only way to kind of sort out your thoughts is by talking it out with the good folks of the internet. That's you guys. The Silverblood Promise by James Logan has been all over Twitter and YouTube lately, getting into the hands of some of the biggest booktubers. The marketing for it has seemingly been pretty successful, but that's kind of my problem with it. I do want to do a spoiler-free review for the book in this video, but first I want to talk a little bit about modern marketing in the publishing industry. There's been a real problem for a while now where it seems like most marketing from authors and publishers rides the blurry line of almost false advertising, and I won't stand for it! All these books kind of float around in the same general circles and get blurbed and compared to each other over and over and over, when actually they're nothing like what they're being compared to. How many books have you seen that say, for fans of Game of Thrones, when actually they're nothing like Game of Thrones? Way too often. What this does is set up certain expectations. If you tell me that something is like Red Rising, I'm expecting a very dark and morally ambiguous setting and story and characters, really bloody and gory action, great political maneuverings backed up by brutal action scenes, backstabbing and conniving, and really amazing character arcs. If what you give me is The Expanse, I'm gonna be a little upset. Take a look at my review for The Pariah by Anthony Ryan. This book at the time was advertised as a kind of dark Robin Hood tale. Not the literal character, but it was supposed to be kind of that vibe. It seemed like it was going to be about a highwayman who robbed passing caravans and merchants and whatnot, and gets screwed over and has to hunt down the people that betrayed him. Sounds awesome, right? John Gwynne even wrote a blurb for it. He says, "A gritty, heart-pounding tale of betrayal and bloody vengeance. I loved every single word." And that's what it was for about 3 chapters, until the main character gets imprisoned and then subsequently inscripted into this army and is like enamored with a religious cultist who convinces him to help her fight a holy war. Is it just me? Or does that not sound at all like a dark Robin Hood story or a gritty, heart-pounding tale of betrayal and bloody vengeance? There's also the obligatory blurb from Publishers Weekly, who I swear to God do not even read these books because they always say, "This makes a rich treat for George R.R. Martin fans." Do you see what I'm getting at here? So let's get back to the Silverblood Promise and look at the blurbs on this guy. This book was being advertised and hyped up as a book that was supposed to be really similar to the Lies of Locke Lamora, and even the description of the book sounded like it was kind of in that vein. In fact, Scott Lynch himself endorsed the book by saying, "A fast-paced carnival of setbacks and skullduggery that reminds me of me. Charming from the first twist to the last." Now, if you're looking at about 90% of the quote, he's not necessarily wrong given how vague his blurb is, but I can tell you right now, this book is nothing like Scott Lynch's work. When you think of a Scott Lynch book, what do you think of? I think of amazing banter and dialogue, complicated characters that you kind of hate but also really want to see win, betrayals that blow your mind, super creative cursing, and really incredible and intricate plots, not to mention that they're extremely grimdark. This book is nothing like that. It's not without its own set of things that it does really well, but you should not go into this book thinking that it's going to be anything like The Lies of Locke Lamora or any of the other books in the Gentleman Bastard series. But by far the most baffling part of the description is this. Set in a city of traitors and thieves, monsters and murderers, this thrilling epic fantasy debut is a must-hear for fans of Nicholas Eames and Joe Abercrombie. I literally have no idea why this book would be compared to either of those authors. They literally have nothing in common. At least with the whole Scott Lynch thing, I can kinda see why people might try to compare the two, but this book has nothing in common with Nicholas Eames, and especially not Joe Abercrombie. Are you starting to see my problem with this kind of marketing? And obviously, this is usually more on the publisher's side than it is the authors, but the authors take all this marketing mumbo jumbo and parrot it out on social media, leading even more people to think that they're getting something that they're probably not getting. The only one that I've seen recently that did it kind of well was The Will of the Many, and that said that it would be good for fans of Red Rising and Kingkiller, which I think is a pretty good comparison, honestly, but there's definitely some more nuance to be had there. There's something in my eye, and it's driving me nuts. One of the issues with this kind of marketing is that it works really, really well. It gets people excited and it gets people hyped and it drives sales. So the publishers see this and they're like, yeah, we'll just keep doing that, and nothing changes. But they're not paying attention to all of the readers that are a little bit pissed that they didn't get what was advertised. Okay, so I've been talking about marketing in this video for a while now, and I'm gonna get on to the actual review. But if you want to hear some of my other thoughts on book marketing from a reader's perspective, let me know in the comments down below. I'd especially love to make a video on indie authors marketing, because I think indie authors really need to step up their game when it comes to that. But okay, let's talk about the Silverblood Promise. So if you don't know, the Silverblood Promise is about a guy named Lucan who is kind of a disgraced noble after a duel that went badly when he was younger. When we meet him in the first chapter, he's a gambling alcoholic who is living in this flop house, and he gets word that his father has been murdered. Right before his dad dies, however, he's able to scrawl some words on a piece of parchment that has Lucan's name, the name of a city, and the name of another person. This leads Lucan to hitch a ride across the sea to this city of merchants and thievery known as Saphrona. When he gets there, he realizes that he's very much a fish out of water, and through a series of somewhat unfortunate events, ends up teaming up with this young thief girl known as Flea. The two of them work together to uncover the mystery of the other name on the letter and get dragged deeper and deeper into a conspiracy that involves the merchant houses, the judicial system, and several mercenaries. Now, from that description, you're thinking, but Spencer, this would fit perfectly inside a Scott Lynch novel. And that's kind of why I was a little disappointed by it, because it does seem like it would be really similar to the Gentleman Bastard series, or like it would fit in that world. The problem is, with the Gentleman Bastard series, the characters may be lovable idiots, but they're also extremely capable and clever, all in their own unique ways. Lucan, throughout this entire book, is a bumbling idiot that things just happen to, and he's just swept along while other people make maneuvers around him, and he's constantly trying to keep up, and usually the only thing seeing him through is pure, unadulterated plot armor. I'm not usually one to complain about plot armor because it exists in literally every fantasy book ever written. Like, you know, for the most part, your main character is usually going to be safe in the end. You know that if they are the main character, they will most likely come out relatively unharmed. Side characters can be hit or miss, but usually your main guy is pretty safe. But this was the most egregious example of it I think I've ever seen. If Lucan had been clever and capable and also managed to scrape by on a thin veneer of plot armor, I'd honestly have no issue. But at every turn, he just has no idea what he's doing, and I'm shocked that anyone in this book took him even remotely seriously. My other biggest disappointment is that he's just not super likable like Locke Lamora is. He's not even unlikable. He's just super basic and boring and doesn't have any sort of fun dialogue and banter like Locke Lamora or any of the other characters in Scott Lynch's books. And you can tell that the author tried. And that's the most disappointing part, because it's not bad. Like, it's not necessarily bad writing. Some parts might be, but for the most part, it's okay. It's just not what I wanted, and it's not really what I expected. The secondary character, Flea, is not much better. I think she plays the role significantly better than he does, but she's a very young kid that is kind of following him around and mouthing off to everyone around her. Now, I've seen reviews where people said that she's by far the best character, and you might feel that way, but I mostly just found her annoying and simply a device to tell Lucan about the city. And to be honest, it worked a lot better than some random info dump. However, there was just never that one defining moment that you get in some books where you really start to see an emotional tether between two characters that initially may be at odds but eventually become best friends. They're definitely best friends by the end of the book, but there really wasn't that heartwarming shift where you really see that they care for each other. The book just kind of eventually tells you that they do, and it's like, oh, I guess that happened at some point. She's also a really predictable character. I really felt like I've read this character and her dynamic with Lucan a million other times. A scrappy little thief girl that gets caught stealing by Lucan and inscripted into service as his little protege. She's loudmouthed and uneducated, where he's more careful and cultured and literate. They start off begrudgingly working together, but eventually become friends. And it's honestly like, what book have I not seen this in at this point? It's just a bit overdone. However, the standout character, and one of the only reasons why I want to continue this series, is someone who I can't actually talk about because it's a pretty big spoiler. They come into play in the last 10 or 15% of the book, and I thought they were done really, really well and ended up tying the group together really, really nicely. I wish I could talk about them, but if you want to read the book, then I definitely don't want to spoil it for you. But just know that this part of the book does exist and might convince you to keep reading once you get there. It may sound like I'm being super negative on the book, and I do have plenty of criticisms for it, but again, it's not bad. It's just not the book that I think everyone hoped it would be. I think everyone needs to lower their expectations going into this book and just know that it's going to be a fun summer read, but it's not going to be the Lies of Locke Lamora, and it's certainly not going to be similar to Nicholas Eames or Joe Abercrombie. It's kind of like a fun movie that you go see with your friends on the weekend and then forget about it for a while until the sequel comes out, and then you go see that one because the last one was pretty good, so why not? Kinda like the Planet of the Apes movies. That's actually a decent comparison. But for real, I think this book would be better compared to the Elder Empire books by Will White. I think that's actually a really great comparison. It's super similar as far as the level of skill of writing, the characters and dialogue are super similar, and just the general vibes are kind of the same. I can't really explain it off the top of my head, but like the The magic stuff that's on in that book is pretty similar, and I just think that they're kind of in sync there. If I had to compare it to something else, I might try to compare it to Among Thieves by M.J. Kuhn. I think they're kind of on the same level as far as the writing goes. The characters have similar levels of depth, although I do think that MJ shows her characters a little better. But as far as dialogue and storytelling and world building, I think those are pretty similar as well. A couple things that I do want to praise it for is that the narrator who did the audiobook is fantastic. It's actually Brennick O'Connor, who played in Game of Thrones. I'm not sure what character he was, but he was in the show, and he does an excellent job. Honestly, one of the best narrations I've heard recently. Can't give him enough praise. If I had read this in print, I may have gotten a little bored and given up on it at some point, but I kept coming back to hear his take on all of these characters' voices, and I thought they were really great. Another thing I really liked was the world building. There was a lot of different factions at play between the different merchant houses and the criminal underground, the governing judicial system, and the bands of mercenaries. All of those were fleshed out really well, even if we, as the reader, at least in this first book, didn't find out everything about them. There's still a lot that wasn't quite explained, but they felt living and breathing, and they were all displayed in a really cool way that made me really intrigued every time a new faction took the stage. I also really liked the city of Saffrona as a whole. It felt very alive. I felt like I could picture it really well in my head, and it just felt like, again, a living and breathing thing that was always moving and kind of in flux with things changing. I did kind of like the plot, but I feel like this comes with some caveats. I will say the plot was always moving forward. I never felt like we were sitting still for too long before the next big thing would happen, but I felt like it moved in a pretty straight line, if that makes sense. It wasn't like twisty and turny. There were times where I was able to completely predict what was going to happen next, and it never really had me guessing too much. The big bad guys get introduced a little too early for my taste, and it felt like the danger was kind of swept out of the room once we actually see them and know a little bit more about them. I would have liked them to be a little bit more mysterious and vague until we got much closer to the end of the book, and this kind of goes along with the predictable nature of the book. Things get revealed along the way, but it never feels like a revelation, if you know what I mean. I never felt like my mind was blown from certain twists and betrayals, and that's really what I was hoping for from this book. And again, I don't know if that goes back to my expectations of this being similar to a Scott Lynch novel, but I just wanted something that was going to be very twisty and turny and very similar to the Lies of Locke Lamora, where, you know, there's a couple things that happen mid to end of that book where it's just like, I did not see that coming in the slightest, and I really felt like I could predict the next like hour of audiobook. and I don't like that at all. However, as I got close to the end of this book, something started to happen. There's a third member, like I said, that kind of joins the main duo, and it really shifts things up a notch. This character was so much more interesting and believable than Flea or Lucan. Well, Lucan was believable, he just wasn't fun. But this character really felt like they broke a lot of the tropes that would normally be assigned to this archetype of character, I guess. I obviously won't spoil the ending, but I really liked the ending, to the point where I actually had a smile on my face as it hints at these three characters going off on another adventure together. And against all odds, against all of my complaints and disappointments and criticisms, just the idea of these three characters being together in the next book for another adventure got me pretty excited for the sequel, and I would read it right now if it were available at the moment. And I think that this is a great example of my final thoughts on the book. It is a book that is greater than the sum of its parts. I can pick apart all sorts of little specific things about the characters and the story and the way that it was all delivered, but when I look at the book from a bird's eye view, I did enjoy my time with it. It was definitely fun, and I'm glad I read it. Now, does that excuse the things that I didn't like about it? No, and I hope that James Logan improves on the next book, but I'm sitting here a couple days after finishing it, and despite my nitpicks, I'm looking back on this book pretty fondly, and I think the ending is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So, at the end of the day, I do recommend this book, with the asterisk of lower your expectations. Don't expect a Scott Lynch, and for the love of God, do not expect a Nicholas Eames or a Joe Abercrombie book. But if you go into it expecting a Will White or an MJ Kuhn, and know that it's just gonna be that fun summertime movie that you saw last weekend with your friends, I honestly think you'll come out of it having a pretty fun experience. Again, it won't be life-changing, but it'll be pretty good. Well, that's gonna wrap it up for me. This ended up being a much longer video than I had anticipated, and I went on a whole marketing rant that I hadn't anticipated, but this was a video that I knew I wanted to do as soon as I started the book. If you've read the Silverblood Promise or plan to, let me know in the comments, or even let me know if you think it's not for you. Are you disappointed in the marketing for this book and many other books? I would love to have that discussion with you, again, in the comments or on Twitter or Discord, which are all linked below. Also linked below is our Patreon page where you can get exclusive content and watch episodes live as we record them completely unedited, weeks before anybody on YouTube gets to watch them. Lastly, make sure you're filling out your 2024 Fantasy Files bingo card, and if you don't have one, check the description for a link to the instructions for it and for the card itself. And if you spell bingo, we will straight up buy you a hardcover trilogy of your choosing, so you don't want to miss out on that. But that's all the housekeeping. Thanks so much for watching, and remember that if you love Game of Thrones, you'll love the Fantasy Files. Not really, we haven't even read Game of Thrones.